Hi, so we're here with Stu on the RockShox Tuning Tour at Bike Park, Wales, and we're going to learn about why it's so important to get your suspension set up correctly.
So yeah, suspension setup is absolutely critical in a mountain bike. I mean, we hear the term a lot, but we're here really at the tuning tour to help people understand a little bit about what the fundamentals of a good bike setup are. And I think that really boils down to one thing, and that's balance. We're looking predominantly for a bike that is balanced so that basically it can ride as the bike designer intended, really. You know, we want the geometry to work in the way that it's intended, and also just get that optimal ride feel. So when I'm talking about balance, I'm talking about having a front and rear shock that are working in harmony with each other. So for example, if we took a worst case scenario, if someone had set up their rear shock super soft and their fork really firm for some reason, then that would really pitch the bike into a sort of almost like tilted back situation, so the back was sitting really deep in its travel, and that would obviously change the geometry effectively of the bike, and so the ride feel could be completely altered by the setup. So the first thing when a rider comes to us here, we're looking to have a quick conversation with them about whether they're experiencing any particular issues with their suspension, talking about maybe the last couple of runs they did on the hill, and then we'd always start with sag. So the sag of the bike is the kind of first port of call for your setup, and that's super important because the shock and the fork have to sit in their travel to start with. They are counterbalancing the rider's weight. So your weight is sitting the bike into its travel, and that's important for mainly so that the shocks can work in both dimensions. So if your wheels are sitting on the ground, once you're into the sag, that wheel can then travel into compressions as well as over bumps in the trail. So that fork and shock can work in both directions once it's sitting into its travel. So the sag is important for that, and that's what really gives us that extra control and grip. When set up correctly, your suspension is also keeping you on the bike. It's keeping keeping your control, because that's what a well set up shock and fork will do for you. And so that's why it's so connected to your enjoyment of the ride. A well set up bike will always feel so much better on the trail. We have the RockShox Trailhead app, which we use a lot when we're doing these tuning tours. So it's a really useful tool. It takes the guesswork out of the initial setup. So I can take the serial number from the fork and the shock, I can plug it straight into the app, and then I can ask you what your rider weight is. We can tick a few other details in there, whether it's an e-bike or not, and so on. And then the app immediately gives me a recommended pressure and rebound setting for your shock and fork. And that's super valuable because, as I say, we're not just starting out in space and trying to work it out. We've got a good start point. The first thing we're doing when we look at someone's suspension setup is we're just going to use our eyes to begin with and just see what's happening. So I'm going to use this bike as an example. I'm going to weight the pedals, and I'm just going to sort of get into the position on the bike where I would be, on a trail. So I'm nice and balanced. I've weighted the bike, and then obviously I wouldn't normally be on the bike, but I'm going to put the O-rings to the bottom. And then what we ask the rider to do is then just step very carefully to the side platforms without actually squashing the suspension any further. So then when you step away from the bike, then we get this visual cue given to us by the O-rings, which is super important. It tells us the gradations on the shock, what the sag setting is, and I can see it visually on the fork as well. So that's my first checkpoint. And I can immediately see that, in terms of balance, we're not too far off with this bike. The next thing, which would be the rebound. So all this before I've even put a shock pump on or done anything technical, I'm just purely using the visual cues to start with. For rebound, what I'm looking for is the speed at which the shock returns to its full extension after a compression. Again, as we mentioned already, the nuances of suspension is that there's no kind of hard and fast rules. Some riders like a slightly quicker feel, some riders like a slightly softer feel, but as a general rule, that's indicative of a bike that's set up a little bit too fast. So you can see the kickback on that shock is quite significant. As you're compressing the suspension, you don't want that rear end particularly to then spring back really fast, because that's going to feel really unnerving, particularly over little lips or jumps. So for me, I would want to slow this down slightly. So there's a rebound adjuster on the shock, which we can turn clockwise in this case to add rebound damping. So they're clicked, so you can feel the clicks as you turn. So I'm just going to turn a couple of clicks and then recheck. So those small changes can make a big difference. So I'm not making big changes. I can feel it's a little bit better, but I'm going to add just another click and then check again. Now you can see straight away there what a difference that's made. So the bike is no longer springing back really quickly. The rear wheel's not like having that tendency to kick off the floor on the rebound. So for me now, that's already starting to feel much more balanced, but actually I'm going to add one more and feel again. So that's where I'd kind of be starting the setup now. So I'm happy with that in terms of the sag. The rebound's starting to feel like it's much more controlled. So off the bat, you know, in terms of the original setup, that's a good place to be aiming for and to start from. Okay, so we apply the same principles to the front fork. So again, I would say this is super quick. As that's coming back to full travel, it's kind of having that tendency to kick, and it's kind of almost lifting the front off the ground. So I would definitely want to slow that down. And to do that, again, we've got a rebound adjuster knob. And in this case, we're turning clockwise. And I would do this in a 2 or 3 clicks at a time. And then I'd go back and recheck, always making a mental note of the number of clicks that I'd done. So it still feels pretty quick. So I'd maybe just add 2 more. I can feel it's starting to have a change. Yeah, so now I can start to feel that change coming. So it's slower. And now I can feel that damping circuit actually like catching the fork as it goes back to full extension, and that's what we want.
Okay, thanks Stu. That was a really clear overview on suspension setup, how to do it and why it's important. And while we've been here watching you to help riders set up their bikes, we've been talking about servicing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a conversation we have all too frequently with riders. I mean, obviously servicing your suspension is super important. You know, I can't stress enough how having that fork and shock working optimally just changes the way that bike's going to ride for you. And to the point where a lot of people will actually come down the hill and talk to us about perhaps small bump sensitivity being, you know, like their hands are aching and maybe they need to make an adjustment to their fork, when actually in reality what they need is to service it. Because when I test the fork in the jig or just on the ground, I can feel immediately that the seals feel dry, they feel grabby, and that's where that fork is really losing all that sort of performance in the small bump sensitivity. So that's why their hands are aching. So they're like coming to us looking for a cure. Maybe we need to dial in some extra changes on the clicks or the air pressure, but actually it's down to servicing. And then, yeah, if the fork and shock are fully serviced, then we know that, you know, we've got that optimal chance for.
So you can always send your fork and shock off to get them serviced,
yeah.
And if you want a full service, but there are user serviceable aspects as well.
100%, yeah. I mean, it's surprising, and we do tech clinics here at these tuning tours as well, and we actually show people how easy it is to do a lower leg service on a front fork. You know, there's guides that we have on the website as well, which are easy to follow step by step, and you don't need to be a super experienced mechanic to actually pull the lowers off a pair of suspension forks. You know, ours have just 2 bolts on the bottom, and then once the lowers are off, it's a simple case of cleaning, putting the correct volume of oil back in, bolting it all back together, and the difference that makes to your forks, you know, just to have the seals correctly lubricated, night and day.
Yeah, makes a big difference.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks. So, suspension setup and servicing. If you want to know more, click the link in the description about the RockShox Tuning Tour, and remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you back here for the next one.